Okay, good evening and welcome to our book talk, Mapping the Darkness with journalist Kenneth Miller. This program is sponsored by the Contra Costa JCC, Congregation B'nai Shalom, and Jewish Book Council in partnership with Diablo Valley Hadassah. My name is Steve Goldman. I am a member of the Contra Costa JCC board, and I am sitting in for Reva Gambert this evening. And before I introduce our author this evening, I would like to share a message from Reva, the director of our Under 110 lecture series. Unfortunately, Reva could not be here this evening. So this is from Reva directly. It's been 9 days since the slaughter of Israelis began in the country's southern region. On Simchat Torah, the day when we rejoiced in the reading of the Torah, we learned that the forces of war had attacked and saw the brutality that was unleashed. Right now, 2 members of the East Bay Jewish Film Festival are safe in Israel in the Tel Aviv area. We have received brief messages of "we're okay" from our friends and family around the country, but with one exception. And this is Reva's younger cousin, Liat, and her husband, Aviv, from kibbutz near Oz, were taken to Gaza and remain hostages there. We pray that they and the other hostages be returned. So we are all hoping for the best, obviously, for Reva and her family. Now on with Kenneth Miller's bio. Kenneth Miller is an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in Time, Life, Esquire, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones, Discover, Aeon, and many other publications. His book, Mapping the Darkness, The Visionary Scientist Who Unlocked the Mysteries of Sleep, was published in October 2023 by Hachette Books. Ken has reported from 4 continents on topics including science, medicine, culture, and the environment. Currently a contributing editor for Discovery, he served as West Coast editor of Reader's Digest, a senior editor of People, and a staff writer at Life. He's also a senior writer for Our Times, the illustrated history of the 20th century. His honors include the John Bartol Martin Award for Public Interest Magazine Journalism, the American Society of Journalists and Authors Outstanding Article Award for Science Writing, and the ASJA's June Roth Award for Medical Writing. Ken has a master's in journalism from Columbia University, where he won the Pulitzer Traveling Fellowship for his thesis on New York City's underground punk rock scene. He plays harmonica and keyboards, lives with his wife and 2 children in a canyon outside Los Angeles. With that, I turn the video over to Kenneth Miller. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Steve. Really, really appreciate it. And I want to thank the folks at Under 110 for hosting me and to all of you for coming. I know it's been a difficult week for everybody, and I hope the story I'm going to tell you tonight offers a bit of inspiration, or at least some distraction. So I would like to start by telling you a bit about the origins of this book. Mapping the Darkness grew out of an assignment for Discover magazine on the latest breakthroughs in sleep science back in 2013. Reporting that article awakened me to something that I found incredibly fascinating: sleep's central role in regulating the intricate workings of our bodies and brains. It also made me curious about the history of sleep science. How did we find out all this amazing stuff? But when I looked for a book on the topic, I found that nobody had written one for ordinary readers. So I decided to do the job myself. And as I started digging, I was surprised to learn that a century ago, there was no such thing as a full-time sleep scientist. Lots of experts considered sleep a wasteful habit that we could learn to overcome. Well, today, of course, we know the truth that sleep is a wildly complex phenomenon, crucial to our physical, emotional, and cognitive health. There are sleep research programs at every major university, a multi-billion-dollar sleep health industry. We're all using CPAPs and wearing sleep trackers on our wrists. So how did sleep come in from the fringe and become a global obsession? My book tells that story through the lives of 4 pioneers who helped shape the field. And as I discovered in my research, this is a story with deep Jewish roots. And that's because the founder of modern sleep science was a refugee from Tsarist Russia named Nathaniel Kleitman. Kleitman started the world's first dedicated sleep lab at the University of Chicago in the 1920s. In 1938, he spent a month in Mammoth Cave trying to shift his sleep-wake patterns to a 28-hour cycle, an experiment that caused a media sensation, thrusting sleep science to the forefront of public consciousness for the first time. And let's show slide 1. Great, and that's a photo from the cave expedition with our hero in the top bunk. So Kleitman wrote the field's first textbook. He mentored the discoverer of REM sleep, Eugene Aserinsky, who revealed that the sleeping brain is as active as the waking brain, a finding that upended our ideas about slumber. Kleitman also mentored William Dement, who invented the discipline of sleep medicine. But Kleitman's saga isn't just crucial to understanding sleep science. It also sheds light on how the Jewish immigrant experience shaped American science as a whole in the first decades of the 20th century. His story shows what it took for Jewish scientists in an era of rampant anti-Semitism to change the world. So let's start at the beginning. Nathaniel Kleitman was born in 1895, a few weeks after his father died of tuberculosis. He was raised by his mother and grandparents in the city of Kishinev, in what is now the Republic of Moldova and was then the Russian province of Bessarabia. From an early age, Kleitman showed signs of the extraordinary intelligence that would someday fuel his fame. The family spoke Yiddish at home, but he learned the Russian alphabet in a single day when he was 2.5 years old. And by the time he started Cheder at age 4, he could solve complex arithmetic problems in his head. When his mother remarried, Kleitman stayed on with his grandparents, who sent him to the best private elementary school they could find. And when his grandfather died, his grandmother set aside a portion of the estate to fund the precocious boy's further education. And Kleitman left behind few details about his childhood, but evidence suggests that his family may have been in the textile business. What's clear is that they belonged to the upper middle class of Kishinev's large Ashkenazi community. Nearly half the city's 125,000 residents were Jewish. They were laborers and factory owners, shopkeepers and tobacco growers, rabbis and blacksmiths, bankers and beggars. And as elsewhere in the Tsarist Empire, they lived under a deepening shadow of persecution. Now, anti-Semitism was nothing new in Russia. Jews had long been restricted to residence in the cluster of territories known as the Pale of Settlement and banned from various trades. Young men faced an added threat, conscription by the Imperial Army, which demanded punitive numbers of Jewish recruits and subjected them to vicious discrimination and abuse. In fact, Kleitman's father may have caught tuberculosis after starving himself to avoid the draft. But conditions worsened in the 1880s after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, which was widely blamed on a Jewish plot. An outbreak of pogroms swept the empire. New laws barred Jews from living in towns of under 10,000 people, from voting in municipal elections, and from professions including teaching and the law. Authorities reduced the already stringent quotas for Jews in higher education. In Kishinev, things got dangerously volatile around the turn of the 20th century, when the city's government-funded newspaper started printing accusations of Jewish evildoing on a daily basis. The explosion came in April 1903, after a Christian boy was found strangled by a relative, it later turned out, and a Christian girl died in a Jewish hospital after poisoning herself. The newspaper's editor claimed both tragedies were ritual murders committed by the Jews, and he called for vengeance. The Kishinev pogrom started on Easter Sunday, shortly before Kleitman's 8th birthday, and it was the bloodiest pogrom yet. And here I'll give a warning. If you'd rather skip the details of the violence, turn down your volume until I hold up my finger. During the two-day rampage, nearly 50 Jews were killed and hundreds injured. Dozens of women were raped. Over 500 businesses were looted. 1,000 homes destroyed. It's not clear how Kleitman's household escaped the onslaught, as in some other cases, the mob may have found the gate to the family compound too hard to break down. What's known is that Kleitman's uncle Ben Zion was among the dead, leaving behind a widow and 6 children. He'd tried to protect them by brandishing a pistol loaded with blanks, but the mob tackled him, gouged out his eyes, and tore out his tongue. As an adult, Kleitman never spoke of the murder in public, but his daughter Hortense told me that it had shaken him deeply. She said he couldn't remember his father's death, but losing his uncle was a real blow. It's interesting how many people who went on to do a lot had that kind of early trauma. Now, the massacre helped turn countless young Russian Jews into militant Zionists or revolutionary leftists. And along with later bloodbaths, including a second one in Kishinev in 1905, it accelerated an ongoing wave of immigration. Between 1880 and 1914, more than 2 million Jews fled Russia, most of them to America. But Kleitman's trajectory followed his lust for learning. After graduating from a private math and science high school in 1912, he knew the quota system would make it tough for him to get into a Russian university. So at first, he set his sights on an engineering school in Paris. But after a visit, he realized he'd never passed the specialized entrance exam. So he decided to try for the American-run Syrian Protestant College in Beirut, Lebanon, with the goal of practicing medicine in Palestine. And now let's show slide 2. Yes, so here's a picture of Kleitman with his mother around the time he left home in his teens. So in 1914, after teaching himself English with a learn-at-home manual, the 19-year-old set out on his personal exodus. First, though, he had to overcome a major obstacle. As a draft-age Jewish male, he was prohibited from getting a passport. So he took the train to Odessa and bought a fake one on the black market. Actually, he bought half a passport. The document was for 2 Lithuanian brothers. That August, he and his fictitious sibling, who he'd never met before, boarded a steamer bound for Lebanon. But the ship never got there. A few hours after it left port, Germany declared hostilities against Russia, and World War I broke out. The next day, after dropping off Kleitman and some other passengers in Constantinople, the vessel sailed back to Odessa to avoid attack by enemy destroyers. Kleitman's fake brother, who had first dibs on the passport, returned to Russia. But Kleitman didn't let the loss of his travel documents stop him. He switched to a Turkish steamer, which carried him the rest of the way to Lebanon. When the ship landed in Beirut, a fellow refugee snuck off and returned with 2 more false passports, one for himself and the other for Kleitman. Now, after some cramming, Kleitman passed the entrance exam for the Syrian Protestant College's medical school. He started taking basic courses in physiology, anatomy, and other subjects. But that October, the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Lebanon, sided with Germany, and the school's Russian students, including Kleitman, became prisoners of war. First, that just meant that they were confined to campus. But toward the end of the school year, things got more ominous. Word arrived that all POWs would soon be sent to concentration camps in the Syrian desert, where massacres of Armenians were already underway. The last hope of rescue lay with the American government, which was still neutral. The college's administration made a desperate plea to the US ambassador to Turkey, Henry Morgenthau Sr., whose background as a German-born Jew may have helped stir his sympathy for the students' plight. Morgenthau arranged for a Navy cruiser to evacuate them from Beirut, along with hundreds of other foreign civilians. In July 1915, the ship dropped the refugees on the Greek island of Rhodes. From there, Kleitman hopped a steamer to Athens, where he took the opportunity to tour the ruins of the Acropolis. And then he boarded an ocean liner heading to New York City. The trip in steerage took 2 weeks. So when Kleitman landed at Ellis Island, he faced an uncertain welcome. At the time, US immigration policy was in the midst of a long slide from the openness embodied in the Statue of Liberty's inscription, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses," etc. Less than a decade later, Congress would pass the Immigration Act of 1924, whose quotas based on national origins were designed to keep out Jews and several other ethnic groups. The restrictionists saw Eastern European Jews as especially objectionable. The problem wasn't just religion, but also race. To supporters of the growing eugenics movement, Jewish immigrants were not quite white. Madison Grant, the genteel founder of the New York Zoological Society, described them as half Asiatic mongrels. A turn-of-the-century newspaper cartoon captioned, "The stranger at our gate," shows a hook-nosed, bearded man in filthy rags carrying baggage labeled poverty, disease, superstition, Sabbath desecration, and anarchy. Now, although ethnically targeted bans still hadn't expanded beyond those imposed on the Chinese in the 1880s, rules barring other kinds of undesirables had multiplied by the time of Kleitman's arrival. Entry was denied to anarchists and polygamists, as well as any alien likely to become a public charge displaying moral turpitude or suffering from a variety of mental or physical illnesses. But still, in 1915, the admissions process was in some ways much easier than it is today. No passport, visa, or other identification was required, a good thing for Kleitman, whose passport might not have passed inspection. Officials performed a brief examination of his mental and physical fitness. They counted the cash in his wallet to make sure he was solvent. They asked if he supported the overthrow of the existing order. He said he didn't. And with that, they ushered him through the golden door. After a ferry ride to Manhattan, Kleitman checked into a dormitory operated by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society on the Lower East Side. He was 20 years old, just one more greenhorn dragging a battered trunk. But within a decade, despite his vow to the immigration authorities, he would begin setting the stage for a revolution neither they nor he could have imagined. Now, at that point, Kleitman had little interest in sleep, other than finding a comfortable place to do it. After a few nights in the shelter, he located family friends from Kishinev, Mrs. Reicher and her daughters, and began boarding in their tenement flat. At first, he hoped to revive the plan he'd envisioned before leaving Russia, to become a doctor, preferably in Palestine. He figured he would wait out the war, then return to medical school in Europe or the Middle East. In the meantime, he worked odd jobs, earning about $1 a day, of which 10 cents was budgeted for the subway and 10 cents for lunch. But by 1916, something had shifted. Maybe he'd realized that the war wasn't stopping anytime soon, or maybe he'd sensed that America offered him another way forward. That fall, he found a job as a laboratory helper at the Rockefeller Institute, rented a room on East 68th Street, and enrolled in night classes at the College of the City of New York in Harlem. Founded in 1847, City College was the oldest free public institution of higher learning in the country. Known as the poor man's Harvard, it would graduate more Nobel Prize winners than any other public college, 13 at last count. Thanks to courses he'd taken in Kishinev and Beirut, Kleitman entered with advanced standing. After 2 semesters, he switched to day classes, focusing on physics, biology, and chemistry. Evenings, he worked as a cashier in a pastry shop. As a resident alien, Clayton wasn't subject to the draft when the US entered the war in 1917. But the following year, along with more than 1,000 other City College students, he volunteered for the Student Army Training Corps, a program initiated by the War Department on campuses across the country. And let's show slide 3. There's Clayton in his Student Army Training Corps uniform. So cadets were housed in barrack dormitories. They performed daily military drills and got a stipend of $30 a month. In the mess hall, Clayton tasted bacon for the first time and loved it, an event he later recalled as a turning point in his Americanization. Soon afterward, he decided to exercise his right as a soldier to expedited US citizenship. His application was granted on November 2nd, 1918, 9 days before the armistice. Clayton graduated in 1919 with a BS in chemistry and a Phi Beta Kappa key for outstanding grades. That fall, he moved on to Columbia University to study for a master's in physiology. By then, he'd realized that his interests lay in research and education rather than in practicing medicine. But he hadn't yet discovered the topic that would obsess him for 7 decades. His master's thesis was titled "Sugar in the Blood of the Frog." After getting his MA in 1920, Clayton faced a dilemma. To pursue his calling, he would have to earn a PhD. In the meantime, he needed to earn a living, but his options in both areas were constrained by his ethnicity. Nativism and anti-Semitism were gaining momentum across the country, driven in part by fears of contagion from Europe's radical movements. Many conservatives attributed Bolshevism, newly triumphant in Russia, to a Jewish-led conspiracy. A resurgent Ku Klux Klan targeted Jews as well as Blacks for cross-burning, though far less often for lynching. In polite Gentile society, even assimilated Jews were commonly regarded as pushy, money-grubbing, clannish, and venal. They were excluded from the best clubs, the best neighborhoods, and many of the best jobs. Meanwhile, in academia, a tidal wave of Jewish undergrads at Northeastern schools was spurring a backlash among so-called Native American students, faculty, and administrators. Most of the newcomers were children of Eastern European immigrants who saw education as the surest way to succeed in their new country. By 1920, the student body at City College was 90% Jewish. At Columbia, the figure was 30%, at Harvard, 20%. Several leading universities, including Columbia, Harvard, and Yale, imposed informal quotas on Jewish admissions in the early 1920s, sharply reducing their numbers. Likewise, Jews who sought academic jobs faced steep obstacles. When Clayton finished his master's, the number of Jews on the faculties of US colleges and universities was probably under 100. Yet the barriers to entry were not impassable. For a candidate of suspect pedigree, a key step toward getting an academic job was backing by a sponsor, often a faculty member from a similar background who'd made it past the gatekeepers. Such an ally would testify to the authorities, as one historian put it, that this man, though a Jew or an immigrant or from the working class, was not insisting on his Jewishness, was devoid of pushing traits, was courteous and quiet in disposition. Clayton's first sponsor was a City College biology professor named Abraham Goldfarb. It happened in a roundabout way, as these things often did. Goldfarb was approached by William Salant, a fellow Columbia alumnus and Russian Jewish immigrant who'd recently been appointed as a professor of pharmacology at the Medical College of Georgia. Salant told Goldfarb he needed to hire an instructor in physiology and pharmacology. Whatever qualifications may have been discussed, both men likely understood that a candidate who faced certain disadvantages would be preferred. At Goldfarb's urging, Salant wrote to Clayton offering him the job. Soon afterward, the 25-year-old stepped off a train in Augusta, Georgia, where he rented a room in the private home where Salant was staying. The professor and his underling shared meals at a nearby boarding house, developing a friendship despite their differences in age and status. Kleitman spent the next 2 semesters teaching medical students material he'd only recently learned, and he did well enough that Salant made him promise to return in the fall of 1921. That June, to earn credits towards his PhD, Kleitman headed north for summer classes at the University of Chicago. There, he found his next sponsor, another fellow immigrant, though from a diametrically different background. This one would help him discover his path. Anton Carlson, chair of the University of Chicago's physiology department, was one of the leading figures in his field, renowned for his research on the peripheral nervous system. Originally from Sweden, he made his way to Illinois at age 16. Working 10-hour days as a carpenter's helper, he saved enough cash to attend a Lutheran college. After graduating, he served a brief stretch as a minister, then lost his faith and headed to Stanford to study science. A groundbreaking paper on cardiac rhythms landed him a teaching position at Chicago in 1904, and within a decade, he'd taken over the department. When he first encountered Kleitman, Carlson was 46, and he may have seen the brilliant and driven young man as a version of himself 20 years earlier. At the end of the summer session, Carlson offered Kleitman an assistantship, which would enable him to earn a salary and a PhD simultaneously. Conscience-stricken, Kleitman turned him down, citing his promise to his employer in Georgia. But in the spring of 1922, after teaching 2 more semesters, he accepted Carlson's standing invitation and relocated to Chicago. And let's show slide 4. Yes, and that's Kleitman right around the time that he moved to the University of Chicago. So before Kleitman could begin his doctoral studies in earnest, he had to choose an area of concentration. And again, his origins placed some routes off limits and may have spurred him to seek out uncharted territory. Because Jewish scholars were unwelcome in many long-entrenched disciplines, they often gravitated towards newer fields. This dynamic, historians have suggested, helps account for the high concentration of Jews in the era's cutting-edge sciences, such as psychiatry, biochemistry, and immunology. It's also possible, of course, that Kleitman was simply drawn to terra incognita by the same questing impulses that had propelled the earliest stages of his journey from Kishinev to Beirut to Ellis Island. In any case, Carlson gave him a gift that no one else had ever offered: enough time and space to explore the existing literature and discover what called to him. Kleitman found it later that year in Henri Pierron's book, Le Problème physiologique du sommeil, in English, The Physiological Problem of Sleep. Published in 1913, Pierron's masterwork was the most comprehensive volume on the topic then available. It provided a sweeping overview of sleep science's evolution since its birth just a few decades earlier. Now, although Western thinkers had pondered the mechanics of sleep since ancient Greece, Aristotle thought it was triggered by vapors rising from the stomach to the heart during digestion. No one had studied the subject seriously until the Industrial Revolution. 2 main forces fueled the surge in interest. The first was the drive for labor efficiency, which spurred researchers to investigate the capacities and limits of the human body. Because sleep affected not only a worker's fitness, but the timing of the workday, understanding its dynamics was essential. The second impetus was the rise of insomnia, an epidemic that emerged with the arrival of cheap and plentiful artificial lighting, which enabled millions to hitch their routines to the alarm clock and factory whistle rather than the rhythms of dawn and dusk. As insomnia grew more common, questions about how sleep worked or didn't became increasingly urgent. Pierron's book cataloged the major lines of inquiry, beginning with the riddle of what triggered sleep. In the mid-19th century, researchers had observed that cerebral blood flow diminished in sleeping animals, and they deduced that sleep resulted from this decline. But this theory raised more questions. If the brain was starved of blood each night, how did it manage to generate dreams? And what started the process in the first place? Well, some scientists pointed to new research on muscular fatigue, which showed that a buildup of waste products could inhibit movement in an overused arm or leg. Perhaps a similar process could immobilize a weary brain. Yet repeated attempts to identify this so-called hypnotoxin had proved unsuccessful. Now, if the mechanisms that turn sleep on and off remained mysterious, so did the behaviors of the brain and body during sleep. Among the most basic enigmas was why people slept heavily at some points during the night and lightly at others. Did these dips and rises follow predetermined cycles, or did they occur in response to external conditions? How much time did sleepers typically spend at one extreme or the other, and how much in the middle? In 1888, an Estonian medical student named Edward Michelson set out to answer these questions. His subjects were 4 young doctors, including himself. Michelson used an electrical apparatus that dropped balls of varying weights onto a wooden board next to a sleeper's head, measuring sleep depth by the amount of noise required to wake the person up. When he tallied the results, he saw that sleep depth reached its maximum about an hour after subjects drifted off, as previous researchers had also found. But the study's other results were startling. Rather than grow steadily shallower as he'd expected, sleep swung rhythmically between peaks and valleys, bottoming out 5 times in a typical night. Michelson regarded these regular fluctuations as a very strange phenomenon, as he put it, and by Pierron's time, scientists still had no grasp of their origin or significance. Le Problème Physiologique described other fascinating experiments. In France, one researcher had tried to gain a more granular understanding of what happened during sleep by monitoring subjects' pulse, respiration, and motor activity. When those measurements spiked in unison, he woke the sleepers, who told him they'd been dreaming. Other researchers had observed similar activity in dogs. These findings put a scientific spin on an ancient puzzle. What are dreams for? The book also covered an emerging debate whether sleep was controlled by a particular area of the brain. Now, this possibility was first raised in 1890 by an Austrian ophthalmologist named Ludwig Mautner, but it was little more than an educated guess. Scientists were just beginning to establish that different brain regions oversaw different aspects of mental and physical function. Evidence for a so-called sleep center remains scarce. And the relationship between sleep and the brain's cellular mechanisms was equally uncertain. Although the existence of brain cells was discovered in the 1830s, the details of their structure remained hidden for over 50 years until new imaging techniques brought them fully to light. Inspired by those findings, researchers began to propose tissue-related theories of sleep, involving the supposed action of the cell's anatomical features. But these notions, too, were purely speculative. The tools to observe brain cells in action, whether in sleep or waking, didn't yet exist. One thing that scientists could measure directly was how organisms were affected by a lack of sleep. The first to do that was a pioneering woman physician and biochemist, Maria Manasena. In 1894, the Russian researcher reported that prolonged sleep deprivation could be deadlier than starvation. She'd reached that conclusion after keeping 10 puppies awake for prolonged periods. Although dogs had been known to survive for nearly a month without food, the subjects of Manasena's experiment all died after a week without sleep. In 1896, a pair of American researchers who tried a similar experiment on humans, the pair kept 3 of their University of Iowa colleagues awake for 90 hours and found that the effects included visual hallucinations, slowed reaction times, diminished grip strength, and weight gain. Yet None of these scientists had committed to exploring the mysteries of slumber beyond these isolated attempts. Sleep was still a sideline for researchers in a variety of fields. No one seemed to have thought of making it their life's work. Kleitman found these explorations electrifying, and he was intrigued by the vast areas that remained uncharted. He later wrote, "I was always interested in the activity of the nervous system in reaction to our environment, and sleep fascinated me as a temporary, purely physiological suspension of that activity." Pierron's book made him hungry to know more. Two more elements may have fed that hunger. The first was an epidemic of brain disease, initially detected in 1916 among patients at a Viennese neurological clinic. The illness's horrific symptoms, which could include vision disorders, convulsive movements, muscular rigidity, and psychosis, fit no existing diagnosis. A neurologist at the clinic, Konstantin von Economo, had identified abnormal sleep as the common thread in all these cases. Patients often fell asleep while sitting or standing, or slept for weeks on end. Others couldn't sleep at all, although they might eventually lapse into a coma and die. Examining the brains of deceased patients, von Economo found distinctive patterns of tissue damage. He named the disease encephalitis lethargica, and by the 1920s, tens of thousands of cases had been reported worldwide. And the other factor that may have spurred Kleitman to focus on sleep was that one of the world's most celebrated scientists, Ivan Pavlov, had recently turned his own attention to the topic. Pavlov was known for having formulated one of the bedrock practices of behavioral psychology, classical conditioning, in which an animal learns to associate an unconditioned stimulus, say a bowl of food, with a conditioned stimulus, a buzzer, salivating when the buzzer sounds, even when the food is absent. Pavlov had observed that dogs often fell asleep when they received repeated or excessive stimuli. He believed this reaction resulted from what he called generalized inhibition, a reflex meant to protect brain cells from being damaged by stress. He reasoned that normal sleep, too, must be an inhibitory response set off by the accumulation of stimuli over the course of the day. Now, this bold theory, which Pavlov published around the time Kleitman was choosing his dissertation topic, would have served as a thrown gauntlet for a young scientist looking to make his mark. Whatever forces set the course of Kleitman's career, he seemed to have achieved a key insight at the very start. To fully understand a disorder like encephalitis lethargica or insomnia, or to determine the validity of a theory like Pavlov's, it would be necessary to develop a detailed physiological picture of normal sleep. And so far, researchers had barely scratched the surface. To make real progress, they'd have to shoulder the task full-time, approach it in a systematic way, and keep at it indefinitely. Kleitman wanted to be the first to go all in. The best place to start, he thought, was with the 24-hour cycles of sleep and waking. Where did these rhythms come from? What were their essential characteristics? To what extent could they be modified? How would such changes affect human health? Probing these questions, he sensed, could keep a scientist busy for a very long time. So sometime in the second half of 1922, Kleitman proposed this course of study to his PhD advisor. Carlson encouraged him, but warned him that he'd be entirely on his own. No one at the university knew enough about sleep to supervise him. For a brilliant and fiercely self-motivated scholar, the warning felt like a blessing. As warm-up exercises, Kleitman performed a series of experiments on the effects of caffeine and narcotics on the sleep of dogs, and another on sleep deprivation in puppies. Then he embarked on a project that heralded his ambitions, the most systematic, thoroughgoing, and technologically advanced study yet undertaken on the physiology of sleep in humans. I'm going to stop there and let you read the book to find out what happened next. But that gives you the basics of Nathaniel Kleitman's very Jewish origin story, which is also the story of how modern sleep science got its start. So now let's open the floor to questions.
So if anyone has questions, you can put them in the chat area and I will ask them. In the meantime, I have a few questions that I could ask. Kenneth, why don't you tell us a little bit about how long it took you to write the book and a little bit about the research that you did?
Sure. So the assignment to start this book, I got in 2013, and that's when I became obsessed with sleep, really. And right around the time I was reporting on this amazing science, everybody in my family started having terrible sleep problems, including myself. I mean, I just wasn't getting enough of it. Freelance writer, I thought, well, 6 hours of sleep a night, that's probably enough. I got a lot to do. It wasn't working. My wife was snoring so loud that she went to a sleep lab to see if she had apnea. My teenage son was forgetting to turn in his homework. He was very absent-minded during the school year and very well focused during the summer. And we realized that, he was being affected by school start times that were too early, because society plays a big part in our sleep problems. So I got totally obsessed with it. Shortly after the book was published, my dad, who was 87 at the time, fell asleep at the wheel of his car and ran into a tree and was badly injured, but survived. But it was a big deal. And I started thinking, boy, sleep, this is really serious stuff. And then I started looking into the book. So started researching the book in 2016, and it's finally published a couple of weeks ago. So 7 years from start to finish. The research, yeah.
No, you go ahead. Keep going.
Oh, sorry. And so the research, I started this. I'm doing all sorts of other work, and so I was doing the research mainly on evenings and weekends, basically. And for the first few years, it was all done remotely. I read like hundreds of scientific articles and journalism articles, news reports from the time. And dozens of books, and interviewed also dozens of people to get this thing done. And eventually, I had to, once I got the book deal, I was able to travel for it. But you were going to ask something.
I was going to just ask you in particular about the Kleitman sections. What kind of research did you do for that?
Yeah, so Kleitman. Kleitman is an interesting character. Kleitman never really thought of himself as a historic figure. So some great scientists, they have archives that contain personal letters that they wrote to their families and their friends, detailed journals. They maybe gave interviews to magazines about their life story. Maybe somebody wrote a biography of them. Maybe they wrote their own autobiography. None of those things for Kleitman. What Kleitman left behind in his archive was a 23-page reminiscence that charted just about every year of his life, and he dictated that to his wife in the 1970s. And so it talked about, sort of in very general terms, what he did each year. But he was a scientist, and he didn't talk about his emotions. He didn't talk about his personal experiences very much. So a lot of this stuff, to find out about him, I interviewed his daughter, who was in her late 80s when I got to her. There is a Kleitman archive at the University of Chicago, where I was able to find his personal files, and I could find jottings that he had done and his notes and all sorts of other stuff. And then I also used things like Ancestry.com, JewishGen.org to try to track down some kind of information about his family, because he never wrote down like what his parents did for a living, for example, and his daughter didn't remember. So there was some indication from his journal, because his mother remarried somebody in the textile business, and because on JewishGen.org I found a directory of businesses in Bessarabia, and particularly in Kishinev, around the time he was born. And his family, there were Kleitmans who were in the fabric business, but it was all trying to just put things together through this sort of process of triangulation and collecting evidence.
Thank you very much. And what were some of the big challenges that you found in the research and also in your writing?
I would say the two biggest challenges, one was just understanding the science, because this is, I'm not a scientist. I came to journalism, as you mentioned when you read my whole resume. I was real generalist. And over the years, I've done enough science and medicine stories that I've taught myself to read a scientific study and things like that. But boy, sleep science is complex. And the longer, the later it goes in history, the more complex it became. Just wrapping my mind around this stuff was just, enough to drive me nuts. The other big challenge really, though, was COVID-19. Because as I mentioned, the first few years of research I was able to do from my desk, but once I got the book deal, I needed to go to the Kleitman archives at the University of Chicago. I needed to go to the archives of his student, William Dement, at Stanford. I needed to fly across country and interview one of the subjects of the book who's still alive, and none of that could happen. And so one of the reasons that the book took 7 years was the last 2 years was waiting for things to open up again, and then running out, getting as much information as I could. And once I got to the Kleitman archives, for example, there was such a wealth of great material that it took several more months to just sort of get through it and assimilate it and figure out what it was all about.
So you mentioned in the book that your grandparents came from the places near where Kleitman grew up and fled for similar reasons. Did that connection influence you as you were writing about Kleitman?
Yes, it did. And that's one of the things, as I was trying to imagine this guy who left very little evidence about what kind of person he was, I realized, so my parents, my grandparents, my maternal grandfather came from Minsk. My maternal grandmother was born in the US, but her folks had fled Russia. My paternal people were from Ukraine. But Kleitman reminded me, as I looked at his picture and read his writings, I realized he reminded me of my maternal grandfather, William Schmidt, who became William Smith when he came to Ellis Island, who became an optometrist, and it had a sort of a similar education to Kleitman. It had a similar mix of sort of a Yiddish earthiness and irony and an almost Prussian sort of respect for hierarchy and scientific authority. And he had worked in a dress factory during the day and gone to optometry school at night, and had, fought his way to becoming a sort of a medical, semi-medical professional. He'd written a book about eye exercises that he was very, very proud of. And I was able to sort of imagine Kleitman really through not only having known my grandfather, but also my grandfather left behind his own memoir, like 300 Xeroxed pages, in which he described partly his childhood in Minsk, and the crazy stuff they had to deal with, from just being this persecuted minority and trying to figure out how to deal with that, and what it was like to come over to America, in his case in 1912. And that was actually very helpful in the creation of this book.
It's very helpful. I'm just curious, also someone who is interested in speech myself, in sleep myself. Did you ever go and have a sleep study done, and have you experienced all that process?
So my own sleep has always been pretty good, but I did undergo a different kind of study. I actually became a subject in a study of sleep, the relationship between sleep quality, mood, and the gut microbiome in people over 60. And this was a total coincidence. I was just invited to participate in this thing at UCLA, and I wound up for over a several week period keeping a sleep diary and wearing one of those wrist actigraphs, as they call it, and then finally going into this lab at UCLA and undergoing all sorts of tests and really just being a guinea pig in this thing. And that was really quite a fascinating and strange experience.
I'm sure it was, for somebody who's researched sleep as much as you have.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any more questions. If anyone has questions, this would be the right time. If not, I'm going to thank everyone for joining the book talk tonight. And before we close, please note that the authors that come to these sessions do not receive any honorariums to speak. We can thank them for the generosity of their spirit by purchasing their books. So we hope that you will, and that they would make a good gift for us, for our libraries, for our friends. You can order The Mapping of Darkness from your local bookstores or directly from the website www.kennethmiller.net. And I thank you very much for joining us. And with that, I think we're signing off. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you all. Good night.